Oklahoma.
I'd ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
I'm going to take some time this afternoon to talk about the pending bill. I understand we're going to have a unanimous consent that the majority leader and I have worked omnibus lands package. And having spent 10 years in a legislative body now, I understand how things work. And I know we've got a bill that's a compilation of 150 plus other bills that is so peppered with individual parochial interests that the hopes of defeating the bill are somewhat diminished. However, I'd be remiss in the oath that I took to the Constitution to not try to inform my colleagues in the Senate, as well and more importantly, the people of this country, what is coming about with this bill. You know, yesterday, one of my constituents sent me a news article described as the following: natural gas rigs shutting means prices may double. Natural gas right now is under $4 a million British thermal units. It was as high as $13 in the height of what I would say, manipulation of the commodity market, but also in the height of the expansion that we saw in economies around the world. Why is that important to the American public? When people look for natural resources, they look for natural resources to find them so they can sell them at a profit. Natural gas exploration in the continental United States, not offshore, is fraught with great difficulties in terms of finding great supplies. However, what we do know in terms of the law of economics, if you cut exploration in natural gas by 45%, and that's just through February of this year versus July of last year, what's going to happen? What's going to happen to natural gas prices? Well, they're going to rise, and they're going to rise significantly. And most probably, they're going to approach $10 a year from now. Is it a great policy that we're going to pass a bill that's going to make it harder to find additional natural gas resources in this country, that shuts off 13 trillion cubic feet of known reserves right now? That's enough to supply our country for 2 years. Is it smart for us to pass a lands package that's going to take 2.8 million acres and say, you can't ever touch it for energy? You can never touch this for energy, regardless if natural gas is $40 a million BTUs. You can't touch it. But at the same time, if our demand rises, what are we going to do? We're going to import it. So we're doing two things highly negative in the long run that will have major effects on the average American family. One is we're going to limit the ability to go find. And number two is we're going to continue to fund imports with our dollars to burn the same natural gas that we could have consumed here and made here and developed here. The same thing could be said for oil. We all remember oil at $140 a barrel. And we pretty well like the gasoline. In my hometown, I filled up for $1.64 this weekend of regular unleaded gasoline versus the highest it got in Oklahoma, I think, was $3.90 a gallon. We like that. But we're getting ready to pass a bill that says the likelihood of us going back to that era of demand-supply inequality will be increased, and that the pay for that will be a tax on every American family's budget. And it was a pretty tough tax if you were commuting, or if you're heating your home with natural gas, or if you're buying heating oil. Many of our families in the Northeast and upper Midwest bought their heating oil at the peak. So the opposition to this bill, from my standpoint, comes from a lot of areas, and I'm going to spend some time outlining that today. But I want to be a predictor of what's going to happen. What's going to happen is energy prices are going to rise. And if you're the greenest of green and think that we can provide all our energy from renewables, great. But what you can't deny is the fact that it's going to take us 20 years to get there. And what this bill is going to do is markedly hamper our ability to supply needed energy products for American families. And it's not just oil and gas. 90% of the known geothermal, an absolutely clean, safe, environmentally friendly way to produce steam and power a turbine to produce electricity, is taken off in this bill. 90% of the known geothermal reserves. So when we say that we want to use renewables and we want to get away from a carbon-based source, there's a couple of things that we have to do. One is recognize how long it's going to take us and make sure we don't have a disruption in our supplies. Number two, markedly increase the supplies that we need in the meantime. And number three, not hamstring our ability to use completely renewable futures from sources that we know are available to us right now. There have been a lot of claims that this bill is not controversial. Well, coming from an energy-producing state, it's controversial as all get out for Oklahoma. When we say we are going to shut off large portions of this country forever to future energy exploration, it doesn't just impact us. Oklahomans have cheap energy. We're the least impacted by it. What the American citizens ought to be asking is why, what did we get individually that can put 150 bills together that will make your representative in Congress vote for something that in the long term is damaging to our energy independence and will keep us more dependent on people who are supplying energy who don't necessarily believe in freedom, don't necessarily like our way of life, and don't necessarily believe that we ought to have the standard of living that we have. This bill has 1,248 pages. 1,248 pages. There's a total of 170 unique different bills. This bill also is going to cost the American taxpayer, our kids, $10 billion. And it has $900 million of mandatory spending that's going to be spent no matter what anybody in Congress says. So we're going to add another $11 billion to our spending. It's opposed by over 200 different groups, whether it's property rights groups, the Chamber of Commerce, energy producing groups, recreation interests across the country, are uniform in their opposition to this bill. And it's not necessarily just in their own self-interest that they're in opposition for it. They know what's coming. They're not thinking short term. They're not thinking about how I look good at home. They're thinking about what is in the best long-term interest of our nation. You know, 100 of these bills really have no effect on us as individual Americans. They won't have an effect on energy. They won't have an effect on property rights. And there probably is no problem with them. But 70 of these bills will markedly impact every American. When this bill went through the House on suspension, and what that means, it's important what you know, that you know what suspension means, is you get a vote on it, but you don't have any opportunity to amend it. It didn't pass the requirement to pass the House, without amendment. This bill has been smoldering here for 2 years. I wish it would smolder a whole lot longer, I'll have to admit that. And this is the first time in 2 years we are going to be able to offer an amendment to change this bill. It's going to be a limited set of amendments, 6 amendments on 1,248 pages of legislation, on $11 billion worth of spending, but more importantly, on a significant decline in the American people's standard of living because energy costs are going to rise. They're going to rise anyway, but they're going to rise dramatically because of what we're going to do in this bill. It's a massive collection of unique provisions, some quite controversial. There's actually a section of wilderness area in one congressman's district that nobody from his district wants, and neither did he, but it got put in the bill. But he has no ability to amend the bill. So we're going to take a section out of one of our states and put it in wilderness area where the citizens don't want that to happen, and the congressman doesn't have the ability to try to stop it. That's what happens when you start playing games and trading things in Congress to pass a bill that can't pass any other way but except for buying off votes with something that looks good at home. It creates 10 new national heritage areas. It creates 3 new units of the National Park Service. We have a $9 billion backlog in just keeping the buildings maintained in our national parks right now. And we're going to add 3 new parks at a time when we're going to have over a $2 trillion deficit. We're going to have a deficit that will add $7,000 per man, woman, and child, $28,000 per family this year alone. This year alone. It creates 14 new studies to expand or create more national parks. It creates 80 new wilderness designations or expansions. It takes 2.2 million acres of direct federal land and says you can never touch this, regardless how much oil's there, how much natural gas there, how much geothermal is there. You can never touch it. No matter what our need is, we'll never be able to access it. How stupid are we when we're going to tell the rest of the world suppliers of oil that we're going to limit our ability to influence their pricing to us? It creates 92 wild and scenic river designations. That's more than we have total wild and scenic rivers now. 1,100 miles of shoreline. It's going to kill an LNG port in Massachusetts that isn't a scenic river at all because we're so green, we don't want to use natural gas, one of the cleanest carbon-based fuels we have. And we're going to eliminate the ability for people in the Northeast to have cheap natural gas. But we're going to do it. It creates 6 new national trails. And I would tell you the trails that it creates have eminent domain. Even though this bill says they're not going to use it, they still have, the bureaucrats still are going to have the ability to take private property from individuals without their consent. The wild and scenic rivers will prohibit any gas transmission lines, any electrical lines, any utility lines that may be in our nation's best interest to either pump oil from Canada or natural gas. You can't go near the river, so you can't cross a river. So what we're going to do is not only we're going to raise the cost, we're going to increase the cost of getting it here because we're going to have to go circuitous routes to bring energy to people in this country. It includes 19 specific instances where federal lands are permanently withdrawn from future mineral and geothermal leasing. 3 million acres are impacted by this permanent withdrawal. The Wyoming range that's in this, according to the National Petroleum Council, 12 trillion cubic feet of natural gas is proven and sitting there right now. That's enough to run our country almost 3 years. 300 million barrels of oil, and that's by the BLM on the most up-to-date study. Each of the 19 withdrawal provisions of 3 million acres also excludes future geothermal leasing. Studies performed by the Bureau of Land Management confirm geopotential on many of the designations in this bill. In other words, it's been studied. I'm going to have a chart down here later to show that. We know where the geothermal sources are in this country. Clean energy, cheap, abundant, and yet we're going to take it away. We're going to say we're not going to use it. The threats posed by this bill to American energy independence have grown since the last time we considered this bill. Secretary Salazar has withdrawn 77 major leases in Utah. He's withdrawn eight. These are leases that are already completed, signed, and paid for. 8 energy leases in Wyoming. Outside of this bill, he's delayed any increase in offshore drilling because it, quote, needs more study. We do it with perfection in the Gulf of Mexico. Produce a vast quantity of our oil that we produce domestically comes from there. And he has delayed the development of oil shale because it needs more testing, except all the prototype plants have been highly effective in how they've utilized that. The bill's another direct challenge from Congress to President Obama's pledge to clean up the earmark process. There's multiple earmarks in this bill for things that none of us would be proud of, and none of us would say meet with any common sense, especially in light of the fiscal and monetary difficulties that we find ourselves. There's $1 billion for a water project in California to repopulate 500 salmon. There's $5 million for a wolf compensation and prevention program where wolves that we reintroduced in the wild are now killing cattle. So we're going to reintroduce wolves, then we're going to pay the cattlemen for the cows that the wolves kill, rather than control the wolves. $3.5 million to celebrate the 450th anniversary of St. Augustine, Florida, in 2015. Do you really think that right now we ought to spend $3.5 million to plan a birthday party in 2015 when we're stealing every penny that we're going to spend this year in the remaining portion of this year from our kids and our grandkids? Is that really something we want to do? We're going to spend $250,000 to study whether Alexander Hamilton's home, boyhood estate in St. Croix, the U.S. Virgin Islands, is suitable as a new national park. Well, if that's really important, let's do it after we get out of the mess we're in. Let's don't do it now. Let's don't spend $250,000. What would $250,000 do? It'd buy at least 20 families health insurance for a year. 20 families that don't have it. It would supply lots of small businesses with the working capital that they require to keep going and keeping their employees on board instead of laying them off. This bill gives $5 million for the National Tropical Botanical Garden to operate and maintain new gardens in Hawaii and Florida. Is that really a priority for us right now? Is that something, if we were a family, would we be making those kind of decisions? It gives us a new ocean exploration program that its number one job is to locate, define, and document historic shipwrecks. It may be a good idea in a time of plenty, but in a time of hurt, it's a terrible idea. $12 million for the Smithsonian to build a new greenhouse for a national orchid collection. Is that something we should do now? And a full waiver for the Cave Institute in New Mexico to be fully funded by the American taxpayers rather than the state of New Mexico. Just happens to be one of those little things snuck into the bill. What about property rights? There's little transparency. It's estimated that the federal government now owns 653 million acres. 1 out of 3 acres in the United States and 1 out of 2 acres in the western United States. The 10 new national heritage areas, what does that mean? The Park Service funds advisory committees in these heritage areas, which means they have an advantage over the local residents because they have money. So they come in and pass requirements and code changes that impact private property rights in all these areas. So if you're in the heritage area or if you're abutting it, you now have the federal government funding a group that may be counter to your own private property rights. 80 wilderness areas, another 2.2 million acres. Recent court decisions have now said that being in the wilderness area isn't enough. If you're close to it, you can't have your property rights. We will decide what you do with your land. 92 national wild and scenic rivers, again, eminent domain. Anything touching it or anything they want to have touch it, they have eminent domain to take private property. And we're going to create 92 of those. So if you live along one of those rivers, you should worry about whether or not you're going to have the freedom to do with your property as you want. Whether you're on the river or not, you just have to be in proximity to it. 6 national trail designations. The underlying National Trails Act grants land acquisition and eminent domain authority. So if they want to put a national trail through your backyard, they can come and take your home. Do we really want to give that kind of capability? And is now the time to do it? Here's a quote from a national property rights advocate. This bill is a serious threat to all property owners in this country. Over the past several decades, there's been a proliferation of programs dedicated to the preservation of land that has extended the grasp of the federal government and its influence over private property rights. Amen. As a result of this legislation, landowners will see their property value diminish due to increased land use regulations, and outdoor recreation enthusiasts will find new restrictions on both public and private land. So you can have private land that you allow people to horseback ride, but if you're next to one of these areas and they're not allowing it in the area, you're not going to be able to allow it. So you may actually even lose income because you no longer have that as a capability of your property. The experts go on and say this legislation should never arbitrarily attempt to seize land from the public and restrict its use, as this package will. You know, the problem is there's no priority in this bill. There's no priority for energy independence or less dependence. There's no priority to protect rights that are guaranteed under the Constitution. Let's think for a minute about what we've tasked the American agencies with. The National Park Service, here's what they're responsible for. 84 million acres of land in the National Park Service, 391 different units, 54 national wilderness areas, which include 44 million acres, 15 wild and scenic rivers, we're getting ready to add 92 to that, 40 national heritage areas, we're getting ready to add 12, 28 national memorials, 4 national parkways, 120 national historic parks, 20 national preserves and reserves, 24 national battlefields, 18 national recreation areas, 74 national monument areas, 10 national seashores, 4 national lake shores, 3,565 miles of national scenic trails, 12,250 miles of unpaved trails, 46 miles of Canadian border, 285 miles of Mexican border to patrol and manage, 27,000 historic structures that are fallen down, 26,830 campsites, 7,580 administrative and public use buildings, 8,505 monuments and statues, 1,804 bridges and tunnels, 505 dams, 8,500 miles of road that they have to maintain yearly, 680 water treatment and wastewater systems, and 272 million visits annually. The National Park Service has a $9.6 million backlog, billion-dollar maintenance backlog. So severe that the backlog grew $400 million since the time we first passed this bill, and it's coming back to us. It grew by the backlog's grown by $400 million. which includes some of our treasures. The U.S. Arizona Memorial, where 1,117 American sailors were killed, faces a backlog of $33.4 million. It's sinking. It's not in the priority. It's not getting fixed. Gettysburg National Battlefield, 51,000 casualties in 3 days, $29 million backlog. The Grand Canyon National Park, $299 million backlog. Statue of Liberty Park, $197 million backlog. The National Mall in Washington, D.C., the mall that's just west of here, $700 million backlog. There's even miscellaneous and supposedly non-controversial provisions in the bill that could pose a threat to American families. It's not intended. It's just that it's a consequence. In this bill is a little provision that if you're on federal lands and you happen to pick up a rock, not intentionally to steal a fossil, but if it has a fossil, 5 years in jail, and they can confiscate your automobile, plus a fine. I mean, one of the amendments we have tries to fix that. We don't have a big problem with fossils being stolen, but we're going to fix a problem that isn't great by this amendment, by this bill, and we need to clean it up. A provision to codify an existing agency program at the Bureau of Land Management will in fact consolidate power over 30 million acres of land into a few anti-energy, anti-recreational bureaucrats. This jurisdiction will extend the wilderness study areas, lands, many of which have been deemed already non-suitable for wilderness. And I'm going to make a point later in the presentation just to show you. Matter of fact, I'll make it right now. One of the things that the law requires is that we, in fact, do studies on the applicability of lands for wilderness area. And my staff just had time to go through California, Oregon, and Washington. By law, it's mandated there has to be a study to see if it's suitable. Well, I'm going to read through some of these. Granite Mat in California. It's not suitable for wilderness recommendation because resource conflicts in the WSA include moderate to high geothermal resource potential. It should never get a wilderness designation. We're going to designate it a wilderness area. Spring Basin, oil and gas, moderate potential for the occurrence based on several factors. Soda Mountain, wilderness study area. California, again, based on this, the entire wilderness study is considered to have a moderate potential for the occurrence of oil and gas. So we know in many of these areas there's tremendous energy potential for us, and we're going to shut it off forever. Sabinoso Wilderness Study Area. Oil and gas. Pinto Mountains, California. 0 acres. This is by Bureau of Land Management. 0 acres were deemed suitable for wilderness, and yet we're going to put that area in wilderness classification. Beauty Mountain, California. No wilderness is recommended for this wilderness study area. The wilderness values for most of the area are not outstanding at all and commonplace. Little Jacks and Big Jacks Wilderness Study Area. Idaho. Natural gas pipeline between it and supposed source of minerals. Bruneau River Wilderness Study Area. Geothermal resources are found at the northern and southern ends of it. The solitude of this area is frequently disrupted by flying military aircraft utilizing the U.S. Air Force bombing range just east of the Wilderness Study Area. All of these, and I can go through Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and we'll go through the rest of them before this debate's over. But the fact is we're not even paying attention to what the law says when we have a study that says they shouldn't be. We're putting them in wilderness areas anyway. One of the things I'd like to do, Mr. President, is enter into the record a study released March 3rd, 2009 by the Department of Interior, on the Department of Interior by the GAO. And I would bet you a nickel against a penny, or any multiple of that, that less than one person in the Senate besides myself has read this report. Because you can't read this report and come out here and vote on this bill. This is the Government Accountability Office. And what they say is the Department of Interior is essentially poorly run, poorly managed, and safety and welfare of our people who are on BLM lands and in the national parks is at risk because of the poor management and the lack of oversight that has been carried out by Congress. The very same committee that brings us this bill. I would ask unanimous consent that it be submitted for the record, and I will deliver a copy later.
Without objection.
I'd also like to have unanimous consent to submit for the record the testimony of Mary Kendall. She's the Acting Inspector General for the Department of the Interior, and her statement before the United States House of Representatives Committee on Appropriations Subcommittee on Interior Environment-related agencies. When you read this, it will scare you to death. Here's what the Internal Inspector General is saying, and it mirrors what the Government Accounting Office is saying. But yet, this has received zero consideration from the authors of this bill. Otherwise, we would see an opportunity to fix the problems that are outlined in these two documents in this bill. There's been no consideration to do it, no consideration to fix the problems, and no significant oversight. What does it find? At no point during their testimony did they agree that it was a good idea to add any additional responsibilities to the Department of Interior based on what has been found in this. We find ourselves in the biggest mess in terms of maintenance. There's actually a public safety and health issues for people who are visiting our parks. It's highlighted through both these reports. There's no attempt to fix any of that. There's no attempt to authorize the money to get the backlog caught up with what we presently have and presently should be taking care of. There's no attempt whatsoever. In the GAO report, the backlog, I quoted almost $9 billion. They're saying it's between $13.2 and $19.4 billion to get our national parks up to date and manage the things that we should be managing. In contrast, the entire budget for the Department of Interior in 2007 was under $11 billion. And we're going to take significant monies that should be spent on backlog of repair and maintenance, and we're going to take those monies to implement this 1,243-page bill. I don't get it. I don't understand the lack of common sense. I understand the political drive. I understand that we want to do things for people back at home. But I don't understand why there hadn't been a change in behavior given this economic situation that we're in. I just flat don't get it. I guess I have a lot to learn about politics. And GAO wasn't necessarily critical of the management of the Department of Interior. They were really critical of Congress. They said, although Interior has made a concentrated effort to address its deferred backlog, the dollar estimate backlog has continued to escalate. It sounds to me like they need some help. And the last thing they need is another 3 million acres with which they have to be responsible for. They classify the backlog into 4 categories: roads, bridges, and trails, between $6 and $9 billion; buildings, including historic buildings, between $2 and $3.5 billion; irrigation, dams, and other water structures, between $2.4 and $3.6 billion; recreation sites and fisheries, between $2 and $2.93 billion. DOI by itself manages more than 500 million acres of federal land, more than 1.8 billion acres of the outer continental shelf, and its 70,000 employees working in 2,400 locations. Yet congressional leadership intends to add another 3 million acres and hundreds of new commitments to DOI in this bill. In one instance of mismanagement in this GAO report, GAO points out the Fish and Wildlife Service is responsible for 132,000 acres of farmland, most of which it doesn't manage. However, even though these farmlands are unwanted, Fish and Wildlife Service can't sell these lands because they're now part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. So Fish and Wildlife owns thousands of acres of good farmland. It doesn't manage and doesn't even inspect. It's less than 13% of the land they inspect yearly. And it's land that we could be using for agriculture production, but yet we don't use it because we've handicapped them, the Congress. What the GAO report also said was that in describing the maintenance backlog, the deterioration of facilities can impair public health and safety, reduce employees' morale and productivity, and increases the cost for major repairs, early replacement of structures and equipment that would not otherwise have to be there. Other groups have made similar observations. According to the National Parks Conservation Association, from neglected trails to dirty or deteriorating facilities, national parks across the country are showing the strain of budget shortfalls in excess of $600 million annually. Well, it's going to be greater than that this year. The Visitor Center at the USS Arizona Memorial in Hawaii is overcrowded, the foundation's cracking, and it's sinking. A shortage of staff and funding limits the ability of the Park Service to maintain campgrounds at Nevada's Great Basin National Park. Broken benches, dilapidated buildings, and a crumbling boardwalk greet visitors to Risk Park and Gateway National Recreation Area in New York and New Jersey. Chaco Culture National Historic Park in New Mexico lacks funding to maintain and repair the park's 28 miles of backcountry trails. As a result, trails are damaged by heavy use and weather. They're not maintained, which then becomes an ecological problem. According to Mary Kendall in her IG report, testimony, their work had documented decades of maintenance, health, and safety issues that places Department of Interior employees and the public at risk. She listed the following. The U.S. Park Police, responsible for maintaining security at the national icons, failed to establish a comprehensive security program, and they lack adequate staffing and formal training for those responsible for protection of those assets. Opportunities for improvement remain in the security of our national dams. The Department's Office of Law Enforcement and Security and Emergency Management still struggles with issues centralized policy and providing effective oversight of DOI in law enforcement. In 2006, they founded a National Park Service Visitor Center that was literally falling apart, severe deterioration at the Bureau of Indian Education elementary and secondary schools, and Fish and Wildlife employees working for almost 7 years in 2 buildings that were condemned and closed to the public. That's how good an oversight we've done. Her statement, people are at risk of being killed, injured, or exposed to dangerous environmental contaminants by abandoned mines, and Congress now is prioritizing a massive increase in the public lands without funding or prioritizing the true national concerns for the Department of Interior. What was also found in the GAO report, despite increasing firefighting funds by 4-fold, that she finds incompetent forest fire management. We all know that we send millions of dollars every year to fight forest fires, but the fact is they're made worse because of poor management of our forests, and yet we've done nothing for that. Her statement, DOI has not managed to even develop goals for maximizing fire management and prevention funds. Another statement, high prevalence of waste and fraud in the procurement and federal assistance process. They found problems throughout the solicitation process. Lack of pre-solicitation planning, lack of competition, selection of inappropriate award vehicles, and poor administration of contracts and grants. Financial management has remained a top challenge for the department. Why don't we fix? You cannot manage what you cannot measure, and the Department of Interior cannot measure anything. And yet we're going to add this bloated bill to it. I won't go on, but there is something that everybody should know. The Native American schools in this country, we're spending $1 billion a year for 50,000 kids. And when you look at performance, what you see is something akin in many areas to Washington, D.C. Not all, but in many. But the cost per student run through that is $20,000 a student. We could put them all with the best private schools, the best private teachers, and bunk them for $20,000 a year. Yet we continue to allow it. BLM grazing fees. The BLM, Bureau of Land Management, collected $12 million in 2004. This is the latest year we have numbers for, which tells you something else about the accounting. Even though the cost to implement the grazing program was $58 million. We'd be better off eliminating the grazing program and saving the $46 million. So what is it about this bill that has had me so persistent? And I'll tell you what it is. It is a great example of what we do wrong. It's a great example of the worst tendencies of Congress. We are in an energy-short environment, even though it doesn't feel that way today. It will feel that way again 10, 12, 18 months from now. And we're going to eliminate potential for us getting out of it. We are going to add significant responsibilities to an agency that both the GAO and their own IG says is in trouble, and yet we don't approach anything to it. And we're going to make everybody feel good in this body because they all got something in this bill, and they can go home and say, look what I did. Look what I accomplished. I got something that's important for our state. But the problem with that thinking is when we only think in a parochial manner. If I only think about Oklahoma, or if the senator from Texas only thinks, or any senator in this body that only thinks, we all lose. The whole country loses. Not once in our oath, not once does it say that our allegiance is to our state. What it says is our allegiance is to our country. And our country, if it's not healthy, no state can be healthy. And yet we have allowed parochialism and the politics of the Senate to design a bill that for sure will pass, that in the long run is going to be harmful to the country. And it's going to pass. It's going to have 65 or 70 votes, maybe even 80 votes. Because the press release at home is more important than the principle in Washington. And consequently, not only will we spend this $11 billion and overburden an agency that's struggling to keep its breath above water, we will commit the Department of Interior to further backlogs, further problems, and we will strangle our ability to respond both with clean energy and the energy we know we're going to need for the next 20 years, the next time the supply-demand balance gets upset. The question the American people ought to ask is it worth it? Is it worth it for somebody from Oklahoma to get something and to do this to the nation as a whole as we get it? Is it responsible? Is that how our country is going to work in the future? Are we going to always place parochial interests first? Or are we going to go back and grab hold of the heritage that made this country great, which says it's the politician doesn't matter, the principle and the forbearance of our forefathers in accomplishing what is best for the nation as a whole? Is that going to win the day? My thoughts are is that it won't. And when it doesn't win the day, I don't lose. I've fought for it. But my kids lose, my grandkids lose, and so does everybody else's in this country. in the name of playing the good game, what we're doing is undermining our country. We have a lot of financial problems in front of us today. We as a nation can get out of those. And matter of fact, we will get out of those in spite of the U.S. Congress. Because what makes America great is its people, not its politicians. What makes America great is the fact that the people get up every day, and no matter what's ahead of them, they're going to still struggle to try to defeat that problem in front of them to make a better life for themselves, their kids, and their neighbors. We could learn a great deal from the average American citizen as we approach a legislation. This little bill, which I assure you nobody has read in this body, is a compilation of 170 bills. Some good, some don't have any negative effects that I've described. But 50 of them are going to have devastating effects. And how we respond, how the American people respond for us doing this, is going to reflect on the character of the American people. They need to become informed about what we're doing. Later today, we're going to have a unanimous consent that I thank the majority leader for. He has the toughest job in the Senate. I recognize that. I have given him fits on this bill. I don't apologize for that. I think this bill is the wrong thing at the wrong time for the wrong reason. But we're going to have unanimous consent that allows 6 amendments that I will offer either later this evening or tomorrow that eliminate some of the stupidity in this bill. It won't fix the bill, it won't fix the problem I described. And so we're going to walk out of here happy. It's then going to go back to the House. It's not going to have a chance to be amended in the House. And the President's going to sign a bill that's going to hurt our energy independence. You're going to hear all sorts of statements to the contrary of that, but that's not true. The fact is it's going to hurt our capability of becoming more self-sufficient for our own energy needs. So a year or 18 months from now, when you're not paying under $2 for gasoline and it's $4, I hope that the American people will remember this bill. Because this is the start of the battle against undermining, utilizing our own resources in our own country for what is in the best interest of this country in the long term, not the short term. And it doesn't have anything to do with climate change or global warming, because if it did, we wouldn't worry about 20 years of carbon usage when we know we're going to go away from it. Mr. President, I thank you for your patience and the time today, and I would note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.